We've all felt forgotten at some point in our lives, cast aside when we couldn't keep up anymore. Sometimes it takes just one person who sees our worth when everyone else has given up on us. On a dusty trail to Fort Yarrow, a cruel freighter kicked his worn-out donkey to the roadside, calling it worthless. The old grey beast lay there as wagons passed, ribs showing, one ear drooped in defeat. Most folks rode on by without a glance. But Jed Collins wasn't most folks. This weathered cowboy had nothing but a can of beans and a heart full of compassion. When he spotted that abandoned donkey at sundown, he knew he couldn't leave it behind. What happened next proved that the most unlikely friendships can bloom in the harshest places. But could one man's kindness truly change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The amber light of dusk painted the Montana sky in shades of copper and gold as Jed Collins guided his horse down the familiar trail toward home. His mount, a steady bay mare named Belle, picked her way carefully around the scattered rocks and dried sage that dotted the path. The air carried the scent of dust and distant pine, mixed with the earthy smell that came after a brief afternoon shower had kissed the parched ground. Jed's weathered hands held the reins with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his 43 years in the saddle. His face, lined by sun and wind, bore the kind of character that came from honest work and hard choices. The brim of his worn hat cast shadows across eyes, the color of winter sky, eyes that had seen their share of loss but still held a quiet kindness. In his saddlebags, along with that single can of beans, lay the sum total of his day's earnings, $3 silver from helping old Pete Morrison repair his fence line. It wasn't much, but it would buy flour and coffee for the week ahead. Jed had learned long ago to make do with less, to find contentment in simple things. As Belle rounded a bend in the trail, something caught his attention. There, about 50 yards ahead, lay a motionless grey shape beside the rutted wagon road. At first glance, he thought it might be a boulder or fallen log, but as they drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his chest tighten. The donkey lay on its side, ribs jutting out like fence posts beneath dull, matted fur. One long ear lay flat against the ground, while the other drooped at an odd angle, as if it had been torn or injured. The animal's breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that raised small puffs of dust with each exhale. Jed dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. Belle nickered softly, her ears pricked forward with concern. The donkey's eyes, large and dark brown, tracked Jed's movement, but showed no fear, only a resignation that spoke of long suffering. "Easy there, old friend," Jed murmured, approaching with the same gentle patience he'd learned from his father years ago. "Let's see what's happened to you." The donkey wore a frayed leather halter, its brass fittings green with age and neglect. The leather was cracked and stained, speaking of years of hard use and little care. Around the animal's neck, the halter had rubbed raw patches where it didn't fit properly, and Jed could see the telltale marks of recent kicks along its flanks, purple bruises beneath the dusty coat. Jed knelt beside the creature, placing a gentle hand on its neck. The donkey's skin felt hot and tight with dehydration, and he could count every rib beneath his palm. This wasn't just an animal that had wandered off. This was a creature that had been abandoned, left to die by someone who saw no value in its continued existence. "Someone threw you away, didn't they?" Jed's voice carried a sadness that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. "Well, I know something about that myself." He reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap with careful deliberation. Water was precious out here, and he had only half a container left for his own journey home. But looking into those weary brown eyes, the choice wasn't really a choice at all. Cupping his hand, Jed poured a small amount of water into his palm and held it near the donkey's muzzle. The animal's nostrils flared at the scent of moisture, and with effort that seemed to cost everything it had left, it raised its head just enough to lap gratefully at the offering. "That's it," Jed encouraged, refilling his palm again. "Small sips now. We'll get you home and see about getting some proper care." The donkey managed 3 more handfuls of water before its strength gave out and its head sank back to the earth. But those dark eyes never left Jed's face, and in them he saw something that reminded him of himself in darker days, a flicker of hope that refused to die completely. Jed's small spread lay another 2 miles down the trail, nestled in a valley where a seasonal creek provided just enough water for a garden and a few head of stock. The cabin was modest, 2 rooms with a stone chimney and a covered porch where he could sit and watch the sunset, paint the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was his, bought with savings from years of cowboy work and the last remnant of his family's lost ranch. The barn was even simpler, just 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry and clean, with fresh straw that he'd laid down just last week. Belle would have to share her space, but she was a gentle mare who'd accept the company. Getting the donkey home would be the challenge. The animal was too weak to walk, and Jed's horse, while strong, wasn't built for hauling dead weight. He studied the situation, his mind working through possibilities with the methodical patience of a man accustomed to solving problems with limited resources. In the end, he fashioned a travois from fallen branches and his spare rope, creating a makeshift sled that Belle could drag. The donkey, though barely conscious, seemed to understand that help had arrived. It didn't struggle, as Jed carefully maneuvered it onto the improvised stretcher, only offered a soft grunt that might have been gratitude. The journey home took twice as long as usual. Belle, bless her heart, seemed to sense the importance of their cargo and maintained a steady, careful pace that wouldn't jar the injured animal. Jed walked alongside, one hand on the donkey's neck, offering quiet words of encouragement. "Won't be much farther now," he said as they crested the final hill. "There's good grass down there and clean water and a warm place to rest. You just hold on a little longer." The lights of Fort Yarrow twinkled in the distance like fallen stars scattered across the prairie. The town was growing had been ever since the railroad came through 3 years ago, but it still maintained the friendly, close-knit character that had drawn Jed to settle nearby. Most folks knew each other's business, which could be a blessing or a curse depending on the circumstances. Dr. Henry Henley, the town's veterinarian, lived on the edge of Fort Yarrow in a neat house with a white picket fence. He'd started as a horse doctor for the cavalry, but had stayed on after his discharge to serve the growing community of ranchers and farmers. More importantly, he was a man who understood that sometimes an animal's life was worth more than the cost of saving it. Martha Wright ran the general store with the efficiency of a woman who'd raised 5 children and buried a husband. She extended credit to those who needed it and never asked too many questions about why. Her store served as the unofficial heart of the community, where news was shared and friendships were forged over cups of coffee and penny candy. Sheriff Tom Bradley kept the peace with a combination of common sense and uncommon compassion. He'd been known to let a hungry man work off a fine by sweeping the jail, rather than sending him away empty-handed. Like most good lawmen, he understood that justice and mercy weren't opposite forces. They were partners in keeping a community whole. By the time Jed reached his cabin, full darkness had fallen. He lit the lanterns with shaking hands, exhaustion and worry, making his movements clumsy. The donkey's breathing had grown more labored during the journey, and he feared he might have arrived too late. But as he knelt beside the travois in the golden lamplight, those brown eyes opened and fixed on his face with an expression that seemed almost human in its gratitude. The donkey was still alive, still fighting, and that was enough for now. Jed carried water in a tin basin and offered it a sip at a time. He brought armloads of fresh hay and spread it thick in the corner of the barn, where the donkey could rest without getting up. From his own meager supplies, he took a jar of liniment that he used for Belle's sore muscles and gently applied it to the worst of the donkey's injuries. "You're going to need a name," he said as he worked. "Can't just keep calling you Donkey. How about Dusty? You're certainly covered in enough trail dust to earn it." As if in response, the animal's good ear twitched forward. and Jed chose to take that as approval. The night was long and filled with worry. Jed dozed fitfully in a chair beside Dusty's makeshift bed, starting awake at every sound to check on his patient. Twice he thought the end had come, but each time those determined eyes would open again, refusing to surrender. Dawn brought the sound of Belle's gentle nickering and the promise of another day. Dusty had survived the night, though he remained weak and barely able to lift his head. But survival was victory enough for now. Jed made his morning coffee with extra care, savoring the bitter warmth as he planned the day ahead. He would need to ride into town for supplies, proper medicine, oats for strength, maybe some molasses to tempt Dusty's appetite. The money in his pocket would have to stretch farther than planned, but some things were worth the sacrifice. As the sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and green, Jed Collins looked at the grey donkey in his barn and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. This broken, cast-off creature needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed it too. The trail ahead wouldn't be easy. Nursing a sick animal back to health required time, money, and patience, all of which were in short supply. There would be those who questioned his judgment, who would say he was throwing good money after bad, wasting resources on a lost cause. But as Jed watched Dusty's ears prick forward at the sound of his voice, he knew he'd made the right choice. In a world that too often threw away anything broken or used up, here was a chance to prove that every life had value, that kindness could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships were the ones worth fighting for. The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and possibility, and Jed Collins prepared to fight for both. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Jed made his decision. Dusty, the name had stuck overnight, lay in the same position, breathing steadily but showing little improvement. The donkey's condition was beyond what Jed could handle alone, with just water and kind words. This would require proper veterinary care, and that meant spending money he didn't have. Jed saddled Belle with deliberate care, his movements betraying the weight of his concern. In his shirt pocket, wrapped in an old piece of cloth, lay the $3 silver from yesterday's work. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He'd make it enough. The ride to Fort Yarrow passed in contemplative silence. Belle seemed to sense her rider's mood, maintaining a steady gait that ate up the miles without jarring urgency. As they approached the town's dusty main street, Jed could see the early stirrings of daily life, storekeepers sweeping their boardwalks, children chasing chickens behind the houses, and the distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against steel. Dr. Henley's office sat at the end of Medicine Street, marked by a simple wooden sign that read, H. Henley, veterinary surgeon, in faded black letters. The building itself was nothing fancy, clapboard siding painted white, with green shutters and a small front porch where patients could wait. But inside those walls was knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for Dusty. Jed tied Belle to the hitching post and climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. Before he could knock, the door opened to reveal Dr. Henley himself, a man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a clean white shirt and dark vest, looking every inch the professional despite the early hour. Jed Collins, Dr. Henley said with a slight smile, I saw you riding up. What brings you to town so early? Doc, I found an animal yesterday, a donkey, abandoned on the trail. It's in poor shape, half-starved, dehydrated, shows signs of being kicked around pretty badly. Jed's words came out in a rush, his urgency overriding his usual measured speech. Dr. Henley's expression grew serious. How bad is it? Bad enough that I'm not sure my amateur doctoring is going to be sufficient. The creature's been through hell, and I think it needs proper medical attention if it's going to survive. The veterinarian nodded thoughtfully. Animal cruelty isn't uncommon out here, I'm afraid. Folks sometimes see their livestock as nothing more than tools, and when a tool breaks. He left the sentence unfinished. Where do you have it now? My barn. I rigged up a travois to get it home, but it hasn't moved much since then. Managed to get some water down its throat, but that's about all. I'll need to examine it properly to give you a real assessment. Can you afford a house call?" Jed's hand went instinctively to his shirt pocket, feeling the small weight of his coins. "What would that cost, Doc?" "My usual fee is $5 for a farm visit, plus any medications or treatments." Dr. Henley's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes were kind. He'd had this conversation before with folks who had more heart than money. $5. Jed's stomach tightened. He had 3, and that was supposed to last the week. But looking at Dr. Henley's understanding expression, he made his choice. "I can give you 3 now, and I'll work out the rest. I've got good hands and a strong back. I can work off whatever I owe." Dr. Henley studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Let me gather my supplies and we'll head out to your place." The ride back to Jed's cabin stretched longer than usual, filled with Dr. Henley's gentle questions about Dusty's condition and Jed's growing anxiety about what they might find. By the time they arrived, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the air and bring out the scent of sage and wildflowers. In the barn, Dusty lay exactly where Jed had left him, though his eyes tracked their movement as they entered. "Doctor," Henley approached slowly, speaking in the same calm, reassuring tone that Jed had used the night before. "Well now, what have we here?" The doctor knelt beside Dusty, his experienced hands beginning a thorough examination. "This is a grey donkey, probably 8 or 9 years old, male, been worked hard by the looks of him." Dr. Henley's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Dusty's eyes, listening to his heart and lungs with a brass stethoscope, examining the worst of the injuries. His expression grew increasingly grave as the examination continued. "The good news," he said finally, "is that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with him that proper care can't fix. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, and these kick marks along his ribs are painful, but not deep enough to cause permanent damage. The ear injury is old, probably torn months ago, and never properly treated. And the bad news? He's been neglected for a long time. This didn't happen overnight. Getting him back to health is going to require weeks of careful feeding, medication for the infections, and constant monitoring. It won't be cheap, and there's no guarantee he'll fully recover." Dr. Henley reached into his medical bag and withdrew several glass bottles and a cloth sack. "This is powdered sulfur for the infections, and this bottle contains a tonic that should help with his appetite and general condition. Mix a teaspoon of each in his water twice daily. The oats in this sack are specially treated with molasses and nutrients. They'll give him the best chance at regaining his strength." He handed Jed a small tin container. "This salve should be applied to the worst of his wounds twice daily. Keep them clean and covered if possible." Jed accepted the makeshift medical kit with hands that trembled slightly. The supplies represented hope, but also responsibility. "How much do I owe you for all this?" "The examination and initial treatment comes to $8 total. The medications and special feed add another $7. Doctor." Henley's voice was gentle but firm. $15 all told. $15. More money than Jed made in a month of odd jobs. More than he'd seen in one place since he'd lost the family ranch. He pulled the 3 silver dollars from his pocket and held them out, his hands steady, despite the turmoil in his chest. "This is what I have right now," he said quietly. "But I meant what I said about working off the debt. Whatever you need done, fence repairs, barn cleaning, hauling supplies, I can do it." Dr. Henley pocketed the coins and nodded. "I believe you can, and I believe you will." He looked down at Dusty, who had managed to raise his head slightly during the examination. "This animal has been through terrible neglect, but there's still fight in him. With proper care, he might make a full recovery." "Might? Nothing's certain with cases this severe. But I've seen animals come back from worse." "Doctor," Henley closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. "The next 72 hours will tell us a lot. If he starts eating the oats and taking water regularly, his chances improve considerably." After Dr. Henley left, Jed sat beside Dusty in the quiet barn, the weight of his new responsibility settling around him like a familiar coat. $12 in debt, with barely enough money left for his own meals, and no guarantee that any of it would make a difference. But as he mixed the first dose of medicine into Dusty's water and watched the donkey drink with increasing eagerness, something shifted in Jed's chest. This wasn't just about saving an animal anymore, it was about proving that kindness mattered, that every life had value, and that sometimes the most broken things could be made whole again. The afternoon brought visitors. Jake Morrison, old Pete's son, rode up as Jed was applying salve to Dusty's wounds. Jake was a practical man who ran cattle on the spread next to Jed's modest property, and his expression as he looked at the donkey was skeptical at best. "Heard you picked up some stray livestock," Jake said, dismounting and approaching the barn. "Word travels fast in a small town." "News does have a way of getting around," Jed agreed, not pausing in his ministrations. Jake studied Dusty with the appraising eye of a man who dealt in livestock. "Doesn't look like much. Probably not worth the feed it would take to keep him alive. Worth isn't always measured in dollars and cents." "Maybe not, but dollars and cents are what keep a man from starving." Jake's tone wasn't unkind, just practical. "You sure this is the best use of your resources? I heard you had to borrow money from Doc Henley just to get him looked at." Jed's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle work. "Sometimes a man has to follow his conscience instead of his ledger book. Conscience doesn't put food on the table or pay for winter hay." Jake shook his head. "Look, Jed, I'm not trying to be cruel, but you're barely making ends meet as it is. Taking on a sick animal that might not even survive, that's not kindness, that's foolishness." Before Jed could respond, Dusty lifted his head and fixed Jake with a steady stare. Those dark brown eyes held an intelligence that was hard to ignore, and something in that gaze made Jake step back involuntarily. "Well," Jake said after a moment, "I suppose every man has to make his own choices. Just don't come asking for help when this decision catches up with you." After Jake left, Jed sat in the growing shadows of evening, his hand resting on Dusty's neck. The donkey's breathing was stronger now, more regular, and he'd managed to eat a small portion of the medicated oats. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. "Looks like it's going to be just you and me against the world for a while," Jed murmured. "Think we can make it?" Dusty's ear twitched forward, and Jed chose to take that as a yes. 3 days had passed since Dr. Henley's visit, and Dusty was showing remarkable improvement. The donkey could now stand for short periods, though he still preferred to rest in the thick bed of straw Jed had prepared. More importantly, his appetite had returned with a vengeance. He'd finished every grain of the medicated oats and was looking hopefully at Jed whenever he entered the barn. Jed had carved a water bucket from a piece of seasoned oak, working by lamplight in the evenings after tending to Dusty's needs. The bucket was rough but functional, carved with the same patient care he'd learned from his father during long winter evenings at the old ranch. Every curve was smooth to the touch, designed to make drinking as easy as possible for an animal still recovering its strength. The hand-carved bucket had become a symbol of their daily routine. Each morning, Jed would fill it with fresh water from the creek, adding the prescribed medicines before carrying it to Dusty's corner of the barn. The donkey had learned to anticipate this ritual, his ears pricking forward at the sound of Jed's footsteps. "Good morning, old friend," Jed said, setting the bucket within easy reach. "How are we feeling today?" Dusty responded by taking a long, grateful drink, then nudging Jed's shoulder with his muzzle. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke of growing trust between them. The improvement in Dusty's condition had not gone unnoticed in Fort Yarrow. Word of Jed's rescue had spread through the community with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Some folks viewed his actions with approval, others with skepticism, and a few with outright disapproval. It was Martha Wright who brought the news that would change everything. She arrived at midday in her small wagon, the bed loaded with supplies for the store. Martha was a woman who believed in direct action and plain speaking, qualities that had served her well in raising 5 children and running a business. "Jed Collins," she called out as she climbed down from the wagon seat. I've come to talk with you about something important. Jed emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a clean rag. Afternoon, Mrs. Wright. What brings you out this way? Several things, actually. Martha's expression was serious but not unkind. First, I wanted to see this donkey everyone's talking about. Second, I have a proposition that might interest you. They walked to the barn together, where Dusty was standing near his water bucket, ears alert and eyes bright. The transformation from the half-dead creature Jed had found was remarkable. The donkey's coat had regained some of its natural luster, and the hollow look of starvation was beginning to fill out. My word, Martha breathed, approaching slowly. I'd heard he was in poor shape, but this recovery is nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Henley's medicines helped considerably, Jed said modestly, but mostly it's been good food, clean water, and patience. Martha extended her hand toward Dusty, who sniffed curiously before allowing her to stroke his neck. He's got a gentle nature. That's not always the case with animals that have been mistreated. I think he knows the difference between kindness and cruelty, Jed replied. He's been nothing but grateful for every bit of care. Which brings me to my proposition. Martha turned to face Jed directly. I need someone to help with deliveries from the store. Nothing too heavy, supplies to the homesteads outside town, special orders, that sort of thing. The pay isn't much, but it's steady work, and you could bring your donkey along to help carry the loads. Jed felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. Steady work was exactly what he needed, especially with the debt to Dr. Henley hanging over him. But there was something in Martha's tone that suggested this wasn't a simple business arrangement. That's generous of you, Mrs. Wright. But I have to ask, is this because you need the help, or because you feel sorry for my situation? Martha's laugh was sharp but not unkind. Jed Collins. I didn't build a successful business by making decisions based on sentiment. I need the help, and you need the work. The fact that it might solve both our problems is just good fortune. What would the work involve? Exactly. 3 days a week to start. I'll give you a route and a list of deliveries. You handle the transportation, keep track of what goes where, and bring back any payments or orders for next time. $2 a day, plus I'll cover feed for your donkey when he's working. $6 a week. It was more regular income than Jed had seen in months, and the offer to feed Dusty would stretch his own resources considerably. But he could sense there was more to this arrangement than Martha was saying. There's something else, isn't there? Martha nodded approvingly. You always were perceptive. Yes, there is something else. Word's gotten around about how you saved this animal, and it's got some folks talking. Good talk, mostly, about how a man shows his character by how he treats creatures that can't defend themselves. And the bad talk? Silas Grayson's been asking questions. The name hit Jed like a punch to the stomach. Silas Grayson was a freighter who ran supplies between Fort Yarrow and the mining camps up in the mountains. He was known for working his animals hard and caring more about profit than anything else. If Grayson was asking questions about Dusty, what kind of questions? About where you found the donkey. About whether anyone's checked for brands or ownership papers. About whether a man has the right to keep an animal he found on a public road. Jed's hand moved instinctively to Dusty's neck, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Martha. He abandoned this animal, left it to die on the trail. You know that, and I know that, but proving it might be another matter entirely. Martha's voice was gentle but firm. Grayson's got a reputation for being possessive about his property, and he's not above using the law to get his way when he thinks he's been wronged. The implications settled over Jed like a cold shadow. If Grayson had owned Dusty and decided he wanted the donkey back, especially now that the animal was recovering, there might be little Jed could do to stop him legally. Has he made any formal claims? Not yet. But Sheriff Bradley thought you should know that Grayson's been nosing around, asking about the legal requirements for claiming abandoned livestock. Jed looked at Dusty, who was watching their conversation with the alert interest of an animal that had learned to read human moods. The donkey had gained weight and strength, but he was still fragile, still dependent on careful care and regular medication. The thought of him falling back into Grayson's hands made Jed's chest tighten with protective anger. "So what do you suggest?" "Take the job," Martha said firmly. "Let folks see you and Dusty working together, being productive members of the community. Show them that this isn't just about sentiment. This is about partnership, a man and his working animal contributing to the town's welfare. And if Grayson pushes the legal angle, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But in the meantime, you'll have steady income to pay off Dr. Henley and prove that keeping Dusty wasn't just an act of charity, it was a sound business decision." Jed extended his hand to Martha, who shook it with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making deals. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll have your first route ready by 8 o'clock. As Martha drove away, Jed stood in the barn doorway, watching Dusty explore his surroundings with increasing confidence. The donkey was still thin, still bore the scars of his ordeal, but there was something different in his bearing, now a dignity that spoke of an animal who knew he was valued. "Looks like we're going into business together," Jed said, refilling the hand-carved water bucket. "Think you're up for some honest work?" Dusty's answer was to walk over and gently bump Jed's shoulder with his head, a gesture that had become their own form of communication. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had each other and the quiet satisfaction of a day's progress toward recovery. The first delivery route took them to 3 homesteads scattered across the valley, each requiring a different approach to the winding trails that connected Fort Yarrow to its outlying settlements. Jed had fashioned a simple bridle from soft rope and leather scraps, designed to fit Dusty's healing head without putting pressure on his injured ear. The donkey had accepted the makeshift tack with patient resignation, as if he understood that work was part of their new partnership. Dusty's first homemade bridle represented more than just functional equipment. It marked the transition from rescue to partnership, from charity case to working animal. Jed had spent hours getting the fit exactly right, padding every contact point with soft cloth and adjusting the straps to accommodate Dusty's still tender injuries. "Easy now," Jed murmured, as he slipped the bridle over Dusty's ears for the first time. "This means we're partners now, not just man and beast." The donkey stood perfectly still during the process, his dark eyes fixed on Jed's face with an expression of complete trust. When the bridle was secure, Dusty shook his head once, testing the feel of the new equipment, then looked at Jed as if to say he was ready for whatever came next. Their cargo for the day consisted of flour, coffee, and medical supplies for the Hendricks family, whose youngest son had broken his arm in a fall from their barn loft. The load wasn't heavy, but it was bulky enough to require careful packing in the canvas sacks that draped across Dusty's back. The trail to the Hendricks place wound through stands of pine and aspen, following an old deer path that had been widened just enough for horses and pack animals. Dusty navigated the rocky sections with surprising sure-footedness, his hooves finding secure purchase on stones that would have challenged a less experienced animal. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Jed observed, watching the donkey's careful placement of each step. "This isn't your first time carrying packs on mountain trails." Indeed, as they progressed through the morning's deliveries, it became clear that Dusty possessed skills that went far beyond simple hauling. At the Morrison Ranch, he helped Jed load fence posts by positioning himself perfectly to balance the weight. When they stopped to water at Willow Creek, Dusty demonstrated an uncanny ability to sense unstable ground, steering them away from a section of bank that looked solid but would have given way under their combined weight. Most remarkably, when they encountered a rattlesnake sunning itself on a boulder near the trail, Dusty's warning bray and quick sidestep probably saved both their lives. The snake slithered away into the rocks, but not before Jed realized how close they'd come to disaster. "Where did you learn to do that?" Jed asked, his heart still racing from the encounter. "That wasn't luck, that was experience." By noon, they had completed all 3 deliveries and were heading back to town with a pouch of coins and several new orders for Martha's store. Dusty's step was springy and confident, his ears pricked forward with the alertness of an animal who had found his purpose again. It was on the return journey that they encountered Sheriff Bradley, riding patrol along the main trail. Tom Bradley was a man who noticed details, and his experienced eye took in both Jed's satisfied expression and Dusty's obvious competence. "Afternoon, Jed," the sheriff called out, reining in his horse alongside them. "I see Mrs. Wright wasn't exaggerating about your donkey's abilities." "He's proving to be quite the partner," Jed replied, patting Dusty's neck. "Seems to know these trails better than I do." Sheriff Bradley's expression grew serious. "That might be because he's traveled them before. I've been asking around about Silas Grayson's operation, and several folks remember seeing a gray donkey with his pack trains over the years." The words hit Jed like a cold wind. Of course, Dusty would know the trails if he'd been working them for years under Grayson's harsh hand. Every rock and turn would be familiar territory. What exactly has Grayson been saying? He's claiming that someone stole his property, says he had a donkey that wandered off during a supply run, and now he hears there's a grey donkey working around town that matches the description. Sheriff Bradley's voice was carefully neutral. "He's talking about filing formal charges. The animal was abandoned," Jed said firmly, "left to die on the trail. I have witnesses who can testify to its condition." "I believe you, Jed, but the law's the law, and if Grayson can prove ownership—" The sheriff let the sentence hang unfinished. What would constitute proof? Bill of sale, brand registration, sworn statements from witnesses who saw him with the animal. Grayson's a thorough man when it comes to protecting his investments. Jed felt the familiar weight of worry settling in his chest. Just when things were starting to improve, when Dusty was recovering and they were building a working partnership, the threat of legal action loomed over them. Has he filed anything official yet? Not yet. But he's been asking a lot of questions, and he's mentioned bringing in some paperwork from his records. Sheriff Bradley leaned forward in his saddle. "My advice? Document everything. Keep records of the medical treatment, the money you've spent, the work the donkey's been doing. If this goes to court, you'll want to show that you've been acting in good faith." After the sheriff rode on, Jed and Dusty continued their journey in contemplative silence. The joy of their successful first day of work was tempered by the growing realization that their partnership might be more fragile than he'd hoped. Back in Fort Yarrow, Martha Wright was waiting at the store with obvious satisfaction. She examined the completed delivery receipts and counted the payment coins with the practiced efficiency of an experienced merchant. "Excellent work," she declared. "The Hendricks were particularly pleased, said you made the delivery in half the time it usually takes, and your donkey was gentle around their injured boy." "Dusty has a way with people," Jed said, unconsciously using the possessive that might soon be challenged in court. "About that," Martha's expression grew serious. "I heard you ran into Sheriff Bradley on the trail. What's the latest on Grayson's threats?" Jed related the conversation, watching Martha's face grow increasingly thoughtful as he spoke. "Legal ownership," she mused. "That's going to be the key issue. But there's something else to consider. The law also recognizes the rights of someone who improves abandoned property through their own labor and investment. Meaning that the money you've spent on veterinary care, the time you've invested in training and care, the work the donkey's now doing productively, all of that has value. If Grayson abandoned the animal, he might have forfeited his claim through neglect." It was a hopeful interpretation, but Jed could see the uncertainty in Martha's eyes. Legal theories were one thing, courtroom reality was another. "What do you suggest?" "Keep doing what you're doing. Show the community that this is a productive partnership, not just sentiment. And start keeping detailed records of everything: expenses, income, medical care, work performed." That evening, as Jed groomed Dusty in the barn, he found himself studying the donkey with new eyes. Every scar, Every healed wound told a story of the animal's past life under Grayson's harsh treatment. But more than that, every confident step, every gentle nuzzle, every moment of trust spoke to the future they were building together. "Whatever happens," Jed said softly, "you'll never go hungry again. You'll never be abandoned again. I promise you that." Dusty's response was to rest his head against Jed's shoulder, a gesture of trust that felt like both a blessing and a responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had each other and the growing certainty that some bonds were worth fighting to protect. 3 weeks into their delivery partnership, the rhythm of work had become as natural as breathing. Jed and Dusty could complete their routes with an efficiency that impressed even Martha Wright's practical sensibilities. The donkey had filled out considerably, his coat now gleaming with health, and his confidence on the mountain trails was nothing short of remarkable. It was on a crisp October morning, while they were loading supplies for the weekly run to the mining camps, that Silas Grayson finally made his move. The man himself was as imposing as his reputation suggested, tall and broad-shouldered, with steel-grey hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw for potential profit. His wagon was drawn by a team of mules that looked well-fed but hard-worked, their harnesses bearing the efficient but unforgiving marks of a man who viewed animals purely as tools. "You would be Jed Collins," Grayson said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jed straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively to rest on Dusty's neck. The donkey had gone rigid at Grayson's approach, his ears pinned back and his eyes showing white around the edges, a reaction that spoke volumes about their shared history. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jed replied, though his heart was already sinking. This was the confrontation he'd been dreading. Grayson reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age, but still officially sealed. Ownership papers for one grey donkey, male, purchased from the Collins Ranch auction 7 years ago. Bill of sale shows I paid $42 for that animal. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. The Collins Ranch, his family's ranch, lost to debt and misfortune when his father died, and the bank called in their loans. He remembered that auction, remembered the heartbreak of watching everything his family had built, sold off piece by piece. "That was a long time ago," Jed managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "Property doesn't stop being property just because time passes," Grayson replied, unfolding the papers with deliberate care. "This here's a receipt showing the animal was purchased legally and in good faith. That makes it mine by law, regardless of where you found it." Sheriff Bradley had arrived during the exchange, drawn by the raised voices and the small crowd that was beginning to gather. His presence was both a relief and a complication. Tom Bradley was fair, but he was also bound by the letter of the law. "Morning, Silas," the sheriff said with professional neutrality. "I take it this is about the ownership dispute we discussed." "No dispute about it," Grayson said firmly. "I have papers proving that Donkey is my property. Been looking for him ever since he wandered off during a supply run 6 weeks ago." "Wandered off?" Jed's anger finally found its voice. "I found this animal half dead on the trail, abandoned and left to die. That's not wandering off, that's cruelty." Grayson's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Animals sometimes get ideas above their station. Sometimes they need firm handling to remind them of their place. If the beast couldn't keep up with the work, that's its failing, not mine. "You left him to die," Jed said flatly. "I left an animal that was no longer useful, found a replacement and moved on. That's business." Grayson's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing discarding a broken tool. "But now I hear this same animal is working again, pulling its weight. That changes the calculation." The crowd around them had grown larger, including Martha Wright, Dr. Henley, and several other townspeople who had come to witness the confrontation. Their faces showed a range of emotions from anger to sympathy, but all were focused on the legal drama unfolding before them. Sheriff Bradley examined Grayson's ownership papers with the careful attention they deserved. "These appear to be in order," he said reluctantly. "Legal purchase, properly documented." "Then there's no question," Grayson said with satisfaction. "I'll be taking my property back now." "Not so fast." Dr. Henley stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "There's the matter of abandonment and the subsequent care provided by Mr. Collins." "What about it?" "Mr. Collins has invested considerable time and money in this animal's recovery. Veterinary bills, medications, specialized feed. The total comes to over $15 in documented expenses." Dr. Henley's voice carried the authority of professional expertise. "Under territorial law, someone who improves abandoned property through their own labor and investment has certain rights." Grayson's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Abandoned? I never abandoned anything." The animal wandered off. "That's not abandonment, that's loss. The condition of the animal when Mr. Collins found it suggests severe neglect." Dr. Henley persisted. "Malnutrition, untreated injuries, dehydration to the point of near death. That's not the result of simply wandering away." "Are you calling me a liar, Doc?" The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. "Doctor." Henley met Grayson's stare without flinching. "I'm stating medical facts based on my examination of the animal. The evidence speaks for itself." Martha Wright chose that moment to step into the conflict. "There's also the matter of current value versus original purchase price. That donkey's been working steady for 3 weeks now, proving its worth as a pack animal. Mr. Collins has transformed a dying animal into a productive asset, which only proves I was right to buy it in the first place," Grayson countered. "And now I want my property back." Sheriff Bradley held up his hand for silence. "This is getting complex enough that it probably needs to go before Judge Morrison in the county seat. Too many legal questions for me to sort out on the spot." "How long would that take?" Jed asked, his voice tight with worry. "Court's in session next week. We could probably get a hearing within 10 days. Grayson's expression showed his displeasure with the delay. "I'm not waiting 10 days for what's rightfully mine. I have work to do and cargo to move." "Then you should have taken better care of your property in the first place," Martha said sharply. "Animals aren't tools to be discarded when they break down. Ma'am, how I manage my business is my concern, not yours. It becomes everyone's concern when your business involves cruelty to animals." The confrontation was escalating beyond the scope of a simple property dispute. The gathered townspeople were clearly taking sides, with most of their sympathy lying with Jed and Dusty. But sympathy wouldn't matter much in a court of law if Grayson's ownership papers were legitimate. Dusty himself had remained pressed close to Jed's side throughout the exchange, his body language making his preferences clear to anyone who cared to look. The donkey's obvious fear of Grayson and trust in Jed told a story that no legal document could contradict. 10 days, Sheriff Bradley said firmly. Court hearing to determine legal ownership and any claims for reimbursement. Until then, the animal stays with Mr. Collins under the current arrangement. Grayson's face darkened, but he folded his papers with sharp, angry motions. 10 days. But if that court rules in my favor, and it will, I'll be taking what's mine, and there won't be any discussion about reimbursement for unauthorized care. As Grayson climbed back onto his wagon and drove away, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving Jed standing with Dusty and his few close allies. The weight of the coming legal battle settled over them like a storm cloud. "We'll fight this," Martha said firmly. "That man abandoned this animal, and everyone here knows it. Knowing it and proving it in court are two different things," Dr. Henley observed. "But we'll document everything we can." Jed looked down at Dusty, who was gradually relaxing now that Grayson had left. 10 days, he said softly. "We have 10 days to prove that some things matter more than ownership papers." The town meeting was Martha Wright's idea, but it took on a life of its own that surprised even her practical sensibilities. Word had spread through Fort Yarrow like wildfire, not just about the legal dispute, but about what it represented. The community was being asked to decide whether legal ownership trumped moral responsibility, whether cruelty could be forgiven in the name of property rights. The meeting convened in the schoolhouse on Thursday evening, with nearly every adult in town crowding into the small space designed for children's desks and lessons. Someone had brought the town's official record book, its leather-bound pages documenting births, deaths, marriages, and business transactions that formed the backbone of community life. Martha called the gathering to order with the same efficient authority she used to run her store. "We're here to discuss the situation with Jed Collins and the donkey, and what we as a community want to do about it." "What's to discuss?" called out Jake Morrison from the back of the room. "The man has legal papers. Law's the law." "The law's supposed to serve justice," replied Sarah Hendricks, whose family had been recipients of Jed and Dusty's reliable delivery service. "What kind of justice rewards a man for abandoning an animal and then claiming it back when someone else has nursed it to health?" Dr. Henley stood to address the crowd, his medical expertise lending weight to his words. "I examined that donkey when Jed brought me out to his place. The animal was within hours of death from neglect and abuse. The injuries weren't recent. They showed a pattern of mistreatment that went back months." "That's all speculation," Jake Morrison countered. "You don't know how the animal got injured or when. Could have happened after it wandered away from Grayson's outfit." "Could have, but didn't," said an unexpected voice from the middle of the room. Old Pete Morrison, Jake's own father, struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "I seen that donkey working Grayson's pack trains for years, seen how that man treats his animals when he thinks nobody's watching." The room fell silent. Pete Morrison was respected as one of the area's original settlers, a man whose word carried weight precisely because he used it sparingly. "Tell us what you've seen, Pete," Martha encouraged. "Seen him kick animals that couldn't keep up. Seen him leave lame horses at trading posts rather than pay for their care. 3 years ago, I watched him abandon a wagon mule that had served him faithful for a decade, just because the animal developed a limp." Pete's voice was steady but filled with disgust. "Silas Grayson treats living creatures like they was machinery, use 'em up and throw 'em away." Jake Morrison's face reddened. "That's just business, Pa. A man can't run a freight operation by keeping every animal that gets worn out." "No," Pete replied firmly, "but a decent man finds them good homes instead of leaving them to starve." The meeting minutes, being carefully recorded by the schoolteacher, Miss Emily Foster, would later show that the testimony continued for over an hour. Story after story emerged of Grayson's harsh treatment of animals, his disregard for anything that didn't directly contribute to his profit margins. Tom Bradley, the local blacksmith, stood to speak. "Last spring, Grayson brought me a horse to shoe. Animal was lame in 2 legs, ribs showing, but he wanted me to fit it with the heaviest shoes I had because he had a big load to haul. When I suggested the horse needed rest and medical care, he told me to mind my own business and do what I was paid for." "Did you shoe the horse?" someone called out. "No, I did not. Told him to find another blacksmith if he wanted to abuse animals under my roof." More voices joined in. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Silas Grayson had built his freighting business on the backs of animals he worked until they broke, then discarded without a second thought. "This is all very touching," Jake Morrison said during a brief lull, "but it doesn't change the legal facts. The man owns the donkey, and the law protects property rights." "What about moral rights?" asked Dr. Henley. "What about the rights of a man who saved a dying animal through his own sacrifice and labor? Morality doesn't hold up in court." "Sometimes it does," said a quiet voice from the front row. Everyone turned to see Judge Wilson, who had ridden down from the county seat for other business and had been drawn to the meeting by curiosity. "Sometimes the law recognizes that strict application of property rights can lead to unjust results." The judge's unexpected presence changed the entire dynamic of the meeting. This wasn't just a community venting session anymore. This was potential testimony being given before the man who might ultimately decide the case. "Your Honor," Martha said carefully, "we weren't expecting you tonight. I heard there was a town meeting about a legal matter that might come before my court." Thought I'd listen to what folks had to say. Judge Wilson was a man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness tempered by pragmatism. Please continue as if I wasn't here, but his presence had introduced a new gravity to the proceedings. People chose their words more carefully, focusing on facts rather than emotions. Miss Foster read aloud from the meeting minutes, the documented instances of Grayson's treatment of animals, creating an official record that could potentially be used in court. The testimony was damning in its consistency, a pattern of abuse that went back years. "Has anyone here witnessed the current condition of the donkey in question?" Judge Wilson asked mildly. Hands shot up throughout the room. Sarah Hendricks spoke first. "Your Honor, that donkey helped deliver medical supplies to my son when he broke his arm. The animal was gentle around the boy, careful with the load, and worked alongside Mr. Collins like they'd been partners for years. He's been making deliveries all over the valley," added Tom Bradley. "Reliable as clockwork, never causes problems, always well cared for. You can see the difference between an animal that's valued and one that's just used." The testimonies continued, painting a picture of Dusty as not just recovered, but thriving under Jed's care. The contrast with the half-dead creature found on the trail was stark and undeniable. "What about the financial aspect?" Judge Wilson asked. "I understand there have been significant expenses in the animal's care." Dr. Henley produced his medical records with professional precision, $15 in documented veterinary expenses, plus ongoing costs for specialized feed and care. "Mr. Collins has invested considerably in this animal's recovery." "And what's the animal worth now, in your professional opinion?" "In its current condition, working reliably as a pack animal, I'd estimate $60 to $70. A murmur ran through the crowd. The donkey's value had increased dramatically under Jed's care, transforming from a dying animal worth nothing to a valuable working partner. "Interesting," Judge Wilson mused. "Mr. Grayson paid $42 7 years ago for a healthy animal, then, through neglect, reduced its value to essentially nothing. Mr. Collins invested time and money to restore not just its health, but its value as a working animal." The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Legal ownership was one thing, but the moral and economic arguments were heavily weighted in Jed's favor. As the meeting concluded, the official minutes recorded a community consensus that would carry significant weight in the upcoming court proceedings. Fort Yarrow had taken its stand, and that stand was firmly behind the man who had chosen compassion over convenience, partnership over exploitation. Judge Wilson rose to leave, pausing at the door. "This has been quite educational," he said quietly. "Quite educational indeed." 2 days after the town meeting, Jed was grooming Dusty in preparation for their morning delivery route when he noticed something that stopped him cold. As he worked the brush through the donkey's coat, now thick and lustrous with good health, the morning sunlight caught something unusual on Dusty's left shoulder, a faint mark that had been hidden beneath the matted, dirty fur when he'd first found the animal. Setting down the brush, Jed gently parted the hair and leaned in for a closer look. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the ghost of an old brand mark. The hair had grown over it during the weeks of recovery, but the slight difference in texture and color was now apparent in the right light. With trembling fingers, Jed traced the faded outline. The mark was distinctive, a stylized C with a small circle beneath it, surrounded by what looked like the remnants of decorative flourishes. It was a brand he knew as well as his own name, because he had watched his father design it when Jed was just a boy. The Collins family brand. The mark that had been burned into every horse, cow, and working animal on the ranch his grandfather had built and his father had lost. "Dear Lord," Jed whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet barn. "Dusty, where have you been all these years?" The donkey turned his head at the sound of his name, those intelligent brown eyes fixing on Jed's face with the same patient attention he'd shown since that first day on the trail. But now Jed was seeing him with completely new understanding. This wasn't just any abandoned donkey. This was one of his family's animals, sold at auction when the bank foreclosed on the ranch 7 years ago. Dusty had been part of the Collins legacy, had worked alongside Jed's father, had been raised with the same care and respect that had been the hallmark of their operation. No wonder Dusty had taken so readily to partnership with Jed. No wonder he'd shown such intelligence and skill on the mountain trails. He remembered, somewhere in his animal memory, he remembered the Collins way of doing things, remembered being valued as more than just a beast of burden. Jed's hands shook as he sank onto a hay bale, the full implications of his discovery crashing over him like a wave. This changed everything. If Dusty bore the Collins brand, if he could prove the animal's original ownership, then Grayson's claim became far more complicated. But he would need documentation. The brand registry, the original breeding records, anything that could establish the donkey's true origins. And all of that paperwork had been scattered to the winds when the ranch was sold, and the family papers were lost in the chaos of foreclosure. Or had they been? Jed rose with sudden purpose and strode to his cabin, heading straight for the old trunk that sat beneath his bedroom window. He'd avoided opening it for years, too painful to confront the remnants of his family's former life. But now, for Dusty's sake, he would face those memories. The trunk creaked as he lifted the heavy lid, releasing the scent of cedar and old leather. Inside lay the carefully preserved remnants of the Collins ranching operation, his father's journals, breeding records, brand registration documents, and the family Bible where births and deaths had been recorded for 3 generations. Jed's hands moved through the papers with growing excitement and hope. His father had been a meticulous record keeper, documenting every animal purchase, every breeding, every significant event in the ranch's operation. If Dusty had indeed been born on the Collins ranch, there would be a record. He found what he was looking for in his father's ranching journal, a leather-bound volume with pages yellowed by age and use. The entries were written in his father's careful script, each one dated and detailed. April 15, 1918. Jenny mare delivered healthy colt, grey with white markings. Dam's 4th foal, strong and alert. Will make good pack animal when mature. Branded with Collins mark. Jed's heart raced as he read the entry. The date was right, the description matched, and most importantly, the breeding information was documented. But he needed more than just a journal entry. He needed official proof. Digging deeper into the trunk, he found the brand registration papers his father had filed with the territorial government. The Collins brand was officially recorded, with detailed drawings showing the exact design and placement. The stylized C with the circle and flourishes was unmistakably the same mark he'd just discovered on Dusty's shoulder. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. In a separate section of the journal, his father had recorded the animals sold at the foreclosure auction. October 3, 1918, forced sale of all livestock. Grey donkey, 2 years old, Collins brand, sold to S. Grayson for $42. Good animal, deserves better treatment than Grayson typically provides. Breaks my heart to see him go. The words, written in his father's hand 7 years ago, seemed to leap off the page. Even then, his father had harbored concerns about Grayson's treatment of animals. Even then, he'd recognized that Dusty deserved better care than he was likely to receive. Jed carefully gathered the documents, the journal, the brand registration, the auction records, and spread them out on his kitchen table. The evidence was overwhelming. Dusty hadn't just been owned by the Collins family. He'd been born on the Collins ranch, raised with Collins values, and branded with the Collins mark. Grayson's ownership papers, while legal, represented only a chapter in Dusty's life, not his entire story. And that chapter, as Jed was beginning to understand, had been marked by abuse and neglect that violated everything the Collins brand had stood for. There was more. As Jed continued reading through his father's journal, he found references to Dusty's exceptional intelligence and gentle nature. His father had planned to keep the donkey as a breeding animal, recognizing qualities that made him valuable beyond simple labor. The grey colt shows remarkable intelligence, one entry read. Learns quickly, responds to voice commands, and has a gentle nature that makes him ideal for work around children. We'll be sorry to see this one go. The portrait that emerged from the journal pages was of an animal that had been cherished and valued, not just as livestock, but as a partner in the ranch's operation. The contrast with Grayson's treatment couldn't have been starker. Armed with his evidence, Jed made his way to town and Dr. Henley's office. The veterinarian examined the faded brand mark with professional interest, using a magnifying glass to study the details. "There's no question this is an old brand, Dr. Henley confirmed. "The scarring pattern is consistent with a mark applied when the animal was young, and the design matches your father's registration exactly. What does this mean legally?" "It means Grayson's ownership was legitimate at the time of purchase, but it also means you have a prior claim based on your family's original ownership and breeding of the animal." Dr. Henley's voice carried excitement as he grasped the implications. "More importantly, it establishes a pattern of stewardship. Your family created this animal, cared for him according to their standards, and now you've restored him to that same level of care." The news spread through Fort Yarrow like wildfire. By evening, Martha Wright, Sheriff Bradley, and half the town had gathered at Jed's cabin to examine the evidence for themselves. The revelation that Dusty was not just any abandoned donkey, but a Collins family animal returning home, added a powerful emotional dimension to the legal case. "It's like something out of a storybook," Sarah Hendricks marveled. "The donkey finding his way back to his original family after all these years of mistreatment." "More than that," Sheriff Bradley observed, studying the journal entries. "It establishes a clear pattern of care and value that Grayson violated through his neglect." Judge Wilson, when informed of the discovery, agreed to examine the evidence personally. His visit to Jed's cabin the next morning was informal but thorough, as he reviewed each document with the careful attention of a man accustomed to separating truth from fiction. "This is quite remarkable," the judge said finally. "The documentation is comprehensive and appears authentic. Mr. Collins, you've essentially rescued your own family's animal and restored him to the level of care your father would have provided." The hidden brand mark had transformed the entire legal landscape. What had been a simple property dispute was now a story of homecoming, of an animal returning to the family that had created and valued him. Grayson's legal ownership papers were still valid, but they now represented an interruption in Dusty's true legacy rather than the foundation of his identity. As Jed looked at Dusty, really looked at him, he could see traces of his father's careful breeding in the donkey's intelligent eyes and gentle demeanor. This wasn't just about saving an abandoned animal anymore. This was about honoring his father's memory, preserving the Collins family values, and proving that some bonds transcended legal documents. The brand mark was more than just a symbol burned into hide. It was a link to the past, a claim to the future, and a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that lead us home. The morning of the court hearing dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the barn windows and the smell of winter sharp in the air. Jed had been awake since before sunrise, not from anxiety, but from a deep sense of purpose that had settled over him like his father's old coat, familiar, comforting, and perfectly fitted to the task ahead. In his hands, he held his father's ranching journal, its leather cover worn smooth by years of careful handling. The book contained more than just records of livestock and business transactions. It held the philosophy that had guided 3 generations of Collins ranchers, a way of thinking about the relationship between humans and animals that elevated both. A man's character shows clearest in how he treats those who depend on him for care, his father had written on the journal's first page. Animals give us their trust completely. We must prove worthy of that gift. Those words, penned in fading ink 20 years ago, would soon be read aloud in a courtroom where the fate of that trust would be decided. Jed had spent the previous evening preparing his testimony with the methodical care his father had taught him to apply to any important task. Martha Wright had insisted on helping, her practical mind organizing the documents and evidence into a presentation that would be both legally sound and emotionally compelling. "Remember," she had advised, "Judge Wilson is a fair man, but he's also a careful one. He'll want to see clear evidence, not just heartfelt emotion. Let the facts tell the story." The facts were indeed compelling. Dr. Henley's medical records documented the extent of Dusty's neglect and the cost of his recovery. The brand registration papers established the Collins family's original ownership and the care standards they had maintained. The auction records showed how the donkey had passed into Grayson's hands during the family's financial crisis. Most powerfully, the journal entries revealed his father's prescient concerns about Grayson's treatment of animals, concerns that had proven tragically accurate over the intervening years. As Jed groomed Dusty for what might be their last morning together, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 7 weeks ago, he had been a man barely scraping by, doing odd jobs and living day to day. Now he was fighting in court for something that mattered more than money, the principle that kindness should triumph over cruelty, that partnership should be valued over exploitation. Dusty seemed to sense the importance of the day. The donkey stood perfectly still during grooming, his intelligent eyes fixed on Jed's face with an expression that might have been encouragement. When Jed spoke to him, Dusty's ears pricked forward with the attentive posture of an animal who understood that important words were being spoken. "Today we find out if the law recognizes what the heart knows," Jed said softly. "Whatever happens, you need to know that these weeks with you have been a gift. You've reminded me what it means to have purpose, to be needed by someone who trusts you completely." The donkey's response was to gently bump Jed's shoulder with his muzzle, their established gesture of partnership and affection. The ride to the county seat took 2 hours through mountain passes, painted gold and scarlet with autumn leaves. Jed rode Belle while Dusty walked alongside, both animals moving with the easy cooperation that had become second nature. Other travelers on the road recognized them. Word of the court case had spread throughout the region, and many folks had strong opinions about the outcome. "Good luck today, Jed," called out Tom Bradley as their paths crossed near Miller's Crossing. "The whole valley's pulling for you." Similar encounters occurred throughout the journey. The case had become more than a legal dispute. It had evolved into a symbol of the values that frontier communities held dear. In a harsh land where survival often required cooperation and mutual support, Grayson's treatment of Dusty represented everything people found distasteful about pure self-interest. The courthouse in Millerville was a modest 2-story building constructed of local stone, with a dignity that reflected its role as the center of justice for the region. Already, despite the early hour, a crowd had gathered on the front steps, supporters of both sides, curious onlookers, and reporters from newspapers as far away as Denver who had heard about the unusual case. Inside, Judge Wilson's courtroom was arranged with simple wooden benches and a raised platform where justice would be administered. The judge himself was already present, reviewing documents with the careful attention that had earned him respect throughout the territory. Silas Grayson sat at one table with his attorney, a sharp-faced man from the territorial capital who specialized in property law. Grayson's expression was confident, bordering on smug. He clearly believed that legal precedent was firmly on his side. At the opposing table, Jed took his seat beside Martha Wright, who had agreed to represent him despite her lack of formal legal training. Her practical intelligence and deep knowledge of local customs made her a formidable advocate, especially in a case that turned as much on community values as legal precedent. Dr. Henley sat in the front row of spectators, his medical bag at his feet and his testimony carefully prepared. Behind him, nearly every adult from Fort Yarrow had made the journey to witness the proceedings. Their presence was both a comfort and a responsibility. Jed was fighting not just for Dusty, but for the principles his community believed in. Judge Wilson called the court to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. This is the matter of Grayson versus Collins, regarding ownership of one grey donkey and associated claims. Mr. Patterson, you may present your client's case. Grayson's attorney rose with practiced confidence. His presentation was professionally competent, but emotionally cold, focusing entirely on the legal precedent for property rights. He produced Grayson's ownership papers, emphasizing their official nature and the clear documentation of purchase. Your Honor, Patterson argued, the law regarding property ownership is clear and well established. My client purchased this animal in good faith at a legal auction, paying the full asking price and receiving proper documentation. The fact that the animal subsequently wandered away does not invalidate his ownership claim. What about the condition of the animal when it was found? Judge Wilson asked. Regrettable, perhaps, but not relevant to the question of ownership. Animals sometimes fall ill or become injured through no fault of their owners. The law doesn't require owners to provide medical care beyond their means or business requirements. It was a coldly logical argument that reduced Dusty to the status of mere property, no different from a wagon or a mining claim. Patterson concluded by requesting immediate return of the donkey, plus damages for the weeks of unlawful detention. When Martha Wright rose to respond, the courtroom fell silent. Her opening words set a different tone entirely. Your Honor, this case is indeed about property law, but it's also about something more fundamental, the relationship between legal rights and moral responsibilities. Mr. Collins didn't just find a piece of abandoned property. He saved a dying animal through sacrifice and dedication that went far beyond legal obligation. Martha's presentation was methodical but passionate, building from the medical evidence of neglect through the community testimony of Grayson's pattern of animal abuse. She introduced each piece of evidence with careful attention to its legal significance, while never losing sight of the human story behind the documents. The defendant claims this animal wandered away, Martha continued, but the medical evidence tells a different story. This was an animal abandoned to die, discarded by an owner who saw no value in its continued existence. The discovery of the Collins brand mark was presented as the climax of Martha's argument. When she read aloud from Jed's father's journal, describing his concerns about Grayson's treatment of animals, a murmur ran through the courtroom. Your Honor, this isn't just about one donkey. This is about the values that define our community. Mr. Collins has restored this animal, not just to health, but to the standard of care his family established when they originally bred and raised him. Dr. Henley's medical testimony was particularly effective, his professional authority lending weight to the documentation of Dusty's condition and recovery. When he described the extent of the animal's injuries and malnutrition, several spectators audibly gasped. In my professional opinion, Dr. Henley concluded, this animal was within hours of death when Mr. Collins found him. The level of neglect required to produce such a condition goes far beyond normal wear and tear. This was systematic abuse. The most dramatic moment came when Judge Wilson requested that Dusty be brought into the courtroom for examination. The donkey entered with calm dignity, his healthy coat gleaming and his intelligent eyes alert to his surroundings. Mr. Grayson, the judge said, please approach your claimed property. Grayson's advance toward Dusty produced an immediate and unmistakable reaction. The donkey's ears flattened, his eyes showed white, and he backed away with obvious distress. When Grayson reached out his hand, Dusty actually trembled. Mr. Collins, your turn. Jed's approach drew a completely different response. Dusty's ears pricked forward, his posture relaxed, and he willingly moved closer to rest his head against Jed's shoulder. The contrast was so stark that no words were necessary. Judge Wilson observed this demonstration with obvious interest. The animal certainly seems to have preferences, he noted dryly. As the hearing concluded and the judge retired to consider his decision, Jed sat beside Dusty in the courthouse yard, both of them waiting for a verdict that would determine their future together. The evidence had been presented, the arguments made, and the community's values clearly expressed. Now they could only wait for justice to take its course, trusting that truth and compassion would prove stronger than cold legal precedent. Judge Wilson returned to the courtroom after an hour of deliberation, his expression grave and thoughtful. The wooden gavel in his hand seemed to carry the weight of more than just legal authority. It represented the power to determine whether compassion or cold law would prevail. As he took his seat behind the bench, the crowded courtroom fell into absolute silence. This case presents the court with competing claims that go to the heart of property law and moral responsibility. Judge Wilson began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. On one hand, we have clear documentation of legal ownership. On the other, we have equally clear evidence of abandonment and subsequent restoration through considerable personal sacrifice. Jed felt his heart hammering in his chest as the judge's words unfolded. Beside him, Martha Wright sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, while behind them the entire community of Fort Yarrow waited in anxious silence. Mr. Grayson's ownership papers are legitimate and properly executed, the judge continued. The purchase was made in good faith at a legal auction, with full payment rendered and documentation provided. Under normal circumstances, this would constitute an open and shut case of property recovery. Grayson's attorney leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction, while Grayson himself allowed a small smile to cross his weathered features. The legal precedent seemed firmly on their side. However, Judge Wilson said, and that single word changed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. These are not normal circumstances. The evidence presented reveals a pattern of animal treatment that raises serious questions about the responsibilities that accompany ownership. The judge lifted Dr. Henley's medical report from his desk. The veterinary testimony is particularly compelling. Dr. Henley's examination revealed injuries and malnutrition, consistent with systematic neglect over an extended period. This was not an animal that simply wandered away. This was an animal that was abandoned to die. Martha Wright's hand found Jed's beneath the table, squeezing gently as the judge's reasoning began to favor their position. Furthermore, Judge Wilson continued, the discovery of the Collins family brand adds a significant dimension to this case. The evidence shows that this animal was originally bred and raised under a standard of care that stands in stark contrast to the treatment it received under Mr. Grayson's ownership. Jed's father's journal lay open on the judge's desk, its yellowed pages containing the moral foundation for the decision that was unfolding. I have read Mr. Collins Sr.'s journal entries with great interest. His concerns about Mr. Grayson's treatment of animals, written 7 years ago, have proven prophetic. More importantly, his philosophy regarding the relationship between humans and animals reflects values that this court believes are essential to a civilized society. The judge's gaze moved from the legal documents to the faces of the people who had traveled from Fort Yarrow to witness this moment. The testimony of the community regarding Mr. Grayson's pattern of animal treatment cannot be ignored. When an entire community speaks with one voice about a matter of moral significance, the law must take notice. Grayson's confident expression was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing realization that legal technicalities might not be enough to secure victory. The court must also consider the principle of abandonment, Judge Wilson said, his voice growing stronger as he reached the heart of his reasoning. When an owner discards property with the clear intention of relinquishing any claim to it, that abandonment can terminate ownership rights. The medical evidence strongly suggests that Mr. Grayson left this animal to die, constituting abandonment in both legal and moral terms. Dr. Henley nodded approvingly from his seat in the front row, his professional testimony having found its mark in the judge's reasoning. Mr. Collins, by contrast, has demonstrated the kind of stewardship that transforms ownership from mere possession into genuine partnership. His investment of time, money, and care has not only saved the animal's life, but restored it to a level of health and productivity that exceeds its original value. The judge paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing with the most crucial part of his analysis. The law recognizes that property rights are not absolute. They come with responsibilities, and when those responsibilities are abdicated through neglect or cruelty, the law can and should intervene to protect the interests of justice and community welfare. Judge Wilson lifted his gavel, its polished wood catching the light from the courtroom's tall windows. However, before rendering final judgment, this court wishes to hear directly from both parties regarding their intentions for the animal's future care. He turned first to Grayson. Mr. Grayson, should this court rule in your favor, what are your specific plans for this animal? Grayson rose with less confidence than he had shown earlier. Your Honor, the donkey would return to work in my freight operation. It would be used for packing supplies to the mining camps, same as before. And what provisions would you make for its medical care and general welfare? Standard provisions, Your Honor. Feed when needed, shelter when available. The animal would earn its keep through useful work. The coldness of this response was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Grayson was describing Dusty as a tool to be used rather than a living creature, deserving of care and respect. Judge Wilson then turned to Jed. Mr. Collins, what are your intentions should this court rule in your favor? Jed rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon him. Your Honor, Dusty would continue as my partner in the delivery business. He would receive the same level of care that my father provided to all his animals, regular medical attention, adequate feed and shelter, and treatment as a valued member of our operation. And what would happen when the animal becomes too old or infirm for heavy work? He would be retired to pasture and cared for until the end of his natural life, Your Honor. That's what my father would have done, and it's what I intend to do. The contrast between the two answers could not have been starker. One described an animal as disposable property. The other described a lifetime commitment to partnership and care. Judge Wilson set down his gavel with deliberate care, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom like a bell tolling the hour of decision. The contrast in these responses illustrates exactly what this case is truly about, he said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. This court must decide whether animals exist solely for human exploitation or whether they deserve protection from abuse and neglect. He picked up the various documents spread before him, Grayson's ownership papers, the medical records, the brand registration, and Jed's father's journal, weighing them not just as evidence, but as representations of fundamentally different philosophies about the relationship between humans and animals. The law is clear that property rights must be respected, Judge Wilson continued, but the law also recognizes that rights come with responsibilities. When those responsibilities are systematically violated, the law provides remedies to protect both the property and the community's interest in humane treatment. Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing that the legal victory he'd expected was slipping away despite his legitimate ownership papers. Mr. Grayson, this court finds that your treatment of this animal constituted abandonment under territorial law. The medical evidence shows neglect so severe that it amounted to a deliberate decision to discard the animal. When you left it to die on that trail, you forfeited any claim to ownership through abandonment. The judge's words fell like hammer blows, each one demolishing Grayson's confident expectations. Furthermore, the pattern of animal abuse documented by community witnesses suggests a disregard for the welfare responsibilities that accompany ownership of living creatures. Dr. Henley nodded with quiet satisfaction, his professional testimony having played a crucial role in establishing the medical foundation for the abandonment ruling. However, Judge Wilson said, raising his hand as Jed began to feel the first stirrings of hope, This court must also consider the practical demonstration of where this animal's loyalties and trust lie. The judge gestured toward the courthouse yard, where Dusty waited patiently tied to a hitching post. This court has observed firsthand the animal's reaction to both claimants. Such reactions, while not legally determinative, provide compelling evidence of which relationship represents genuine partnership versus mere ownership. Judge Wilson rose from his bench, moving to the window that overlooked the yard where Dusty stood. "Bailiff, please bring both parties and the animal into the courtyard. This court wishes to conduct one final test." The entire courtroom filed outside into the crisp autumn air, forming a circle around the area where Dusty waited. The donkey's ears pricked forward as he saw the crowd approaching, his intelligent eyes scanning the faces until they found Jed's familiar features. "Mr. Grayson," Judge Wilson said, "please position yourself at the far end of the yard." Grayson moved to the designated spot, his expression showing both confusion and growing anger at the unexpected turn of events. "Mr. Collins, please take a position equidistant on the opposite side." Jed walked to his assigned position, his heart racing as he began to understand what the judge intended. "Bailiff, please release the animal and step back. Let us see where its true allegiance lies." The rope was untied from the hitching post, leaving Dusty free to move wherever he chose. The donkey stood for a moment, looking around the circle of faces, clearly understanding that something important was happening. Both men began calling to the animal simultaneously. "Come here, you stubborn beast," Grayson commanded in the harsh tone he'd always used with his animals. "Get over here now." "Dusty," Jed called softly, using the gentle voice that had become their language of partnership. "Come here, old friend." For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, Dusty remained motionless, his ears swiveling between the two voices. Then, without hesitation, he walked directly to Jed, lowering his head to rest against his partner's chest in their familiar gesture of trust and affection. The crowd released a collective sigh of satisfaction, while Grayson's face darkened with rage at this public demonstration of the animal's preference. "This animal has made its choice clear," Judge Wilson announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "In matters where the law provides latitude for interpretation, the preferences of the affected party, even when that party is an animal, cannot be ignored." He returned to the courthouse steps, using them as an impromptu platform for his final ruling. "Therefore, this court finds that Mr. Grayson's ownership claim has been invalidated by abandonment, and that Mr. Collins has established superior right through his restoration of the animal's health and value." The gavel came down with finality. "Ownership of the donkey is hereby transferred to Jed Collins, free and clear of any claims. Mr. Grayson's petition is denied." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, while Grayson stood frozen in disbelief at the courthouse steps. His attorney was already gathering papers and preparing arguments for appeal, but the immediate victory belonged to partnership over exploitation, compassion over cruelty. "Furthermore," Judge Wilson added over the noise of celebration, "this court awards Mr. Collins damages in the amount of $25 to compensate for veterinary expenses and care provided to restore the animal's health." Martha Wright embraced Jed while Dr. Henley shook his hand vigorously. But Jed's attention was focused entirely on Dusty, whose calm acceptance of the crowd's celebration showed the confidence of an animal who knew he was finally, truly safe. Grayson pushed through the celebrating crowd, his face twisted with anger. "This isn't over, Collins," he snarled. "That animal was legally mine, and I'll be filing an appeal with the territorial court." "File whatever you want," Jed replied calmly, his hand resting on Dusty's neck. "But this donkey will never be your property again. He's home now, where he belongs." As Grayson stormed away to his wagon, muttering threats and curses, the community of Fort Yarrow gathered around their vindicated neighbor and his faithful partner, celebrating a victory that meant far more than the ownership of one donkey. 6 months had passed since that decisive day in Judge Wilson's courtroom, and the spring of 1919 had brought a transformation to both the valley around Fort Yarrow and the lives of Jed Collins and his faithful partner. The winter had been hard but fair, with enough snow to promise good water for the growing season and enough clear days to keep the delivery routes open for their expanding business. Jed stood in his barn, adjusting the straps of Dusty's new partnership harness, a beautiful piece of leatherwork crafted by Tom Bradley, the local blacksmith who had taken up leatherworking as a side trade. The harness was a far cry from the crude rope bridle they'd started with. It was designed for comfort and efficiency, with brass fittings that gleamed in the morning sunlight and padding that distributed weight evenly across Dusty's now robust frame. The harness represented everything their partnership had become: professional, dignified, and built to last. It was the physical manifestation of a bond that had grown from desperate rescue to mutual prosperity. "Ready for another busy day, old friend?" Jed asked, scratching behind Dusty's ears, in the spot that always made the donkey's eyes half close with contentment. Dusty's answer was a gentle nicker and the kind of steady, intelligent gaze that had become their primary means of communication. Where once the donkey had been skittish and uncertain, now he radiated the confidence of an animal who knew his worth and trusted his partner completely. Their delivery business had grown beyond anything Jed had dared hope when Martha Wright first offered him work. Word of their reliability had spread throughout the territory, and they now served mining camps, homesteads, and trading posts across a 100-mile radius. The combination of Jed's honest dealing and Dusty's sure-footed navigation of mountain trails had made them the preferred choice for valuable or urgent cargo. More importantly, their success had allowed Jed to pay off all his debts and begin saving money for the first time since losing the family ranch. Dr. Henley had been paid in full, with interest, and had become not just a medical advisor, but a close friend who often stopped by to check on Dusty's continued good health. The irony was not lost on Jed, that Dusty's transformation from dying animal to valuable partner had made them both more prosperous than either had been in years. The donkey, who Grayson had discarded as worthless, was now worth more than $100, and their weekly earnings from the delivery business were enough to support them both comfortably. Martha Wright emerged from the store as Jed and Dusty arrived for their morning cargo, her practical efficiency undimmed by the early hour. 3 deliveries today, she announced, consulting the list she kept in meticulous handwriting. Medical supplies to the Henderson place their new babies, being poorly mail and goods to Copper Creek, and a special delivery to Judge Wilson's ranch. "Judge Wilson?" Jed asked with surprise. "What's he need delivered?" Martha's smile held a hint of mystery. "Legal documents," he said. "Something about finalizing some territorial business that's been pending since last fall." The route to Judge Wilson's ranch was familiar territory now, winding through meadows that were just beginning to show the green flush of spring grass. Dusty navigated the trail with the expertise of an animal who had traveled every rock and turned dozens of times, his hooves finding secure purchase even on sections that were still muddy from snowmelt. Judge Wilson was waiting on his porch when they arrived, a thick envelope in his hands and an expression of satisfaction on his weathered face. "Right on time, as always," he called out, walking down to meet them. "I've been looking forward to giving you this news personally." He handed Jed the envelope with ceremony. Silas Grayson's appeal was rejected by the territorial court last week. They not only upheld my ruling, but commended the decision as setting an important precedent for animal welfare law. Jed felt a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying lift from his shoulders. For months, the threat of Grayson's appeal had hung over them like a distant storm cloud, never quite allowing him to fully relax into their new prosperity. "There's more," Judge Wilson continued. "The territorial legislature is using our case as the foundation for new laws requiring minimum standards of animal care. They're calling it the Collins Act, in honor of your father's philosophy about the responsibilities that come with animal ownership." The news was overwhelming in its implications. Not only were Jed and Dusty safe from any future legal challenges, but their story had helped change the law itself, providing protection for other animals who might face similar neglect. "Your father would be proud," Judge Wilson said quietly. "His beliefs about treating animals with dignity and respect are now part of territorial law." As they continued their delivery route, Jed found himself thinking about the circle of events that had brought them to this moment. A dying donkey abandoned on a trail had become a partner, a friend, and ultimately a catalyst for positive change that would benefit countless other animals. The afternoon brought them to their final stop, a new homestead where a young family was struggling to establish themselves in the harsh but promising valley. When Jed and Dusty arrived with their supplies, flour, coffee, medicine for a sick child, they found something that made Jed's heart clench with recognition. Tied to a fence post was an old horse, thin and obviously neglected, its ribs showing through a dull coat. The animal's condition was eerily similar to how Dusty had looked that first day on the trail. "That horse belonged to you?" Jed asked the homesteader, a young man named Peterson, who looked exhausted by the challenges of frontier life. "No, sir. Found it wandering yesterday, no brand or owner in sight. Don't rightly know what to do with it." Jed looked at the abandoned horse, then at Dusty, who was studying the newcomer with intelligent interest. "What do you say, partner?" he asked softly. "Room for one more in our operation?" Dusty's answer was to walk over to the horse and gently touch its muzzle with his own, a gesture of welcome that seemed to say that every creature deserved a second chance. 2 hours later, they were heading home with an additional member of their partnership, a bay mare who Peterson had been happy to give away to someone who would care for her properly. She walked between Jed and Dusty with the tentative hope of an animal learning to trust again. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jed Collins looked at his growing family and felt a contentment that went deeper than financial success or legal victory. They had proven that compassion was practical, that kindness was profitable, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that led broken souls back home. In the distance, the lights of Fort Yarrow twinkled like earthbound stars, welcoming them back to a community that had learned the value of standing together for what was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new deliveries, and perhaps new souls in need of rescue. But tonight, they had each other, and that was enough.